Good evening, dear listener, and welcome back to the Drowzy Historian. As you settle in tonight, let your thoughts slow. The noise of the present fades, and in the dim hush that follows, another world begins to take shape. The year is 1095, but time feels softer here, the edges of centuries blurred by candlelight and memory. The air smells of earth and wood smoke. A church bell tolls somewhere in the distance, and with it, a story begins, not of saints or kings alone, but of ordinary souls who believed they could touch eternity with their hands. Picture a Europe still half asleep after centuries of fear, fields scarred by raids, villages haunted by hunger. Winter meant survival, not celebration. Faith was not an idea, it was breath itself. Every illness was the devil's whisper, every harvest a prayer answered or denied. And yet beneath the weariness, there was restlessness, a quiet ache for meaning, for redemption, for proof that suffering led somewhere. It was in that restless world that a voice rose, echoing from a small town in France, a voice that would shake the world and bind it in blood and belief for generations. At Clermont, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd of peasants, knights, and nobles. His words were carried by cold November air, and though the chronicles dressed them in grandeur, what reached the people was simple. Your brothers in the East are suffering. Christ commands you to save them. Take up the cross. No one there could have known that those words would send tens of thousands marching east, that they would reshape the map of the known world. But that day, they felt something that Europe had not felt in centuries: purpose. For the peasant, it meant forgiveness. For the knight, absolution for a lifetime of violence. For the priest, proof that God still spoke through men. For the desperate, it was a chance to make suffering holy. And so they took the cross. Literally. Some sewed strips of red cloth onto their tunics. Others branded it into their flesh. Husbands kissed their wives goodbye, swearing to return cleansed of sin. Sons left their fathers' ploughs in the field. Whole villages emptied, swept eastward by a fever that had no name but faith. If you found this quiet retelling by chance tonight, you're welcome to stay with me, to walk among these pilgrims of the past, not as heroes or villains, but as human beings trying, in their own fragile way, to reach heaven by the only road they knew, through the dust and blood of the earth. If this kind of slow descent through history brings you peace, consider subscribing not as an obligation, but as a way to return whenever the night grows long. Now, let us begin our journey east. The First Crusade did not begin with armies. It began with hunger. Those who took the cross were not soldiers yet. Most were farmers, craftsmen, women and children. They left behind fields already barren and debts already unpaid. They believed that by marching to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem, the place where Christ had walked, they could wash away every sin they had ever committed. But the journey was not blessed. It was chaos. In the spring of 1096, long before the lords and princes were ready to march, the People's Crusade, as history would later call it, stumbled into motion. Led not by kings, but by a wandering preacher known as Peter the Hermit. They set out barefoot, carrying crosses and hopes, and little else. Imagine that procession, thousands moving across Europe like a living prayer. The poor walked alongside thieves and repentant killers. They sang hymns, they carried relics, bones of saints, and fragments of the true cross that were often anything but. Some pushed carts piled with children. Others rode donkeys. To many, it felt like the world was ending. And perhaps it was. They believed the Last Judgment was near, that by reaching Jerusalem they could stand at Christ's side when heaven opened. But the road to God passed through the lands of men, and men were cruel. As the crowds moved east through the Rhineland, desperation grew. Supplies ran out, leadership faltered, and faith, that beautiful fire, began to twist into something darker. Rumors spread that the journey itself was a test, that before saving Christ's tomb, they must purge his enemies closer to home. Then came the first massacres. In towns like Worms, Mainz, and Cologne, the Crusaders turned on their Jewish neighbours, men, women and children who had lived in Europe for centuries. They were accused of killing Christ anew, of hoarding gold meant for God's war. Entire communities were wiped out. Rabbis were burned alive. Families chose suicide over baptism. In some chronicles, the scribes call these acts zeal. In truth, they were madness, the moment when faith unmoored itself from mercy. By the time Peter the Hermit's followers reached the edge of Byzantine lands, Their numbers had already thinned. Starvation, disease, and vengeance had claimed many. When they crossed into Asia Minor, they were no longer pilgrims. They were an army without discipline, without food, without allies. The Byzantines, Christian themselves, looked upon them with dread. Emperor Alexios the Komnenos, ruler of Constantinople, had asked for help, but this was not what he had imagined. He had wanted trained knights, disciplined soldiers. Instead, he saw a mob. He fed them, ferried them across the Bosporus, and prayed they would not return. They never did. On the plains of Anatolia, near Nicaea, the Turks, seasoned fighters of the Seljuk Empire, fell upon the Crusaders. The battle was brief and merciless. Thousands were slaughtered. The survivors were sold into slavery. Peter the Hermit himself escaped, returning to Constantinople to await the next wave. That was how the People's Crusade ended. A sea of unmarked graves in foreign soil, faith burned away by sun and sword. But the fire they had kindled did not die. It only changed hands, because now the princes were coming. Across Europe, banners were raised, each noble promising to reclaim Jerusalem for Christ. But beneath the holy words ran older instincts: pride, debt, rivalry. Some went to save their souls. Others went to win lands, titles, or absolution for crimes too heavy to bear. The call of faith had become a chorus of ambition. From Normandy rode Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman warlord whose hunger for conquest was legendary. From Lorraine came Godfrey of Bouillon, a pious knight who sold his lands to join the journey. Raymond of Toulouse brought thousands from the south of France, while Robert of Flanders and Hugh of Vermandois, brother of the King of France, marched from the north. They came from different kingdoms, spoke different tongues, and trusted neither God nor each other completely, but they all wore the same red cross. And so, in the summer of 1097, 4 great armies of the West gathered under the shimmering domes of Constantinople, the gateway between worlds. What began as a sermon in a French field had become a movement of nations. The Emperor Alexios received them with wary courtesy. To him, these men were both saviors and threats, armed pilgrims with their own agendas. He demanded oaths that any city they conquered once held by Byzantium would be returned to imperial rule. Some swore sincerely, others crossed their fingers as they did. Then, one by one, they crossed the Bosporus, the narrow ribbon of water that divided Europe from Asia. For the first time in centuries, Western Christendom had entered the East, not as traders or pilgrims, but as an army. What awaited them, there was more than just the enemy. It was the desert, the heat, the endless horizon, and the weight of their own faith. The First Crusade had truly begun. When the first of the crusading armies crossed into Asia Minor, they entered a land that seemed to belong to no world they had ever known. The air shimmered with heat, the soil baked and cracked beneath their boots. Villages lay empty, fields abandoned. For men who had left behind the green hills of France and the valleys of the Rhine, it was like stepping into Scripture itself, a place where every horizon looked ancient and every silence felt holy. At their head rode Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, and the rest of that strange brotherhood, princes, barons, and knights who had come to serve God and, if possible, themselves. Behind them trailed tens of thousands, soldiers, priests, cooks, smiths, and pilgrims, bound together by faith and fatigue. Their first target lay not far, the city of Nicaea, once Byzantine, now held by the Seljuk Turks. For the Crusaders, it was more than a fortress. It was a test. For Emperor Alexios, it was a measure of whether these Westerners could be controlled. The siege began in the spring of 1097. The city's walls were thick and ancient, its towers strong, its defenders well supplied. The Crusaders had few siege engines, no navy, and little experience in the art of war against eastern fortresses. Yet what they lacked in skill, they made up for in devotion. They encircled Nicaea, built wooden towers, and prayed before each assault. At night, priests moved among them, lifting crucifixes high over sleeping men. They told them that every wound would cleanse a sin, every death opened the gates of heaven. Still, for weeks, the walls held. Stones and arrows rained down from the towers. Men died by the hundreds in trenches filled with their own blood. And yet the siege did not end in conquest, but in diplomacy. Unknown to most of the Crusaders, Alexios had sent his own envoys to the city. He negotiated a secret surrender with the Turkish garrison, promising them mercy in exchange for handing Nicaea back to Byzantine control. When the Crusaders awoke one morning to find the imperial banner flying from the ramparts, they were stunned. They had expected loot and glory. Instead, they were told to move on. No plunder, no triumph, only obedience. Resentment simmered beneath the prayers. The Byzantines had achieved their goal. The Western Knights had been used. It was the first of many cracks that would divide them. But there was no time for bitterness. Ahead lay the road to the heart of the Seljuk Empire, and the road was death. The Crusaders marched through Anatolia, a land of dust, heat, and hunger. The Turks burned wells, poisoned streams, and filled the air with arrows. Men and horses collapsed under the sun. Armor grew so hot that it burned through clothing. Bread ran out, water turned to mud. Chroniclers wrote that men drank the blood of their horses when thirst overcame reason. Others peeled bark from trees and boiled leather for food. In their misery, they sang hymns through cracked lips, their voices trembling like prayers spoken through fever. Then, near a place called Dorylaeum, the Turks struck. It was July 1st, 1097. The vanguard of the Crusader army, Bohemon's force, had moved ahead of the rest when the Seljuk cavalry appeared. Their leader, Kilij Arslan, had returned from defeat at Nicaea, burning for revenge. His horsemen surrounded the Crusaders like a storm. Arrows darkened the sky. The knights, heavy in armor and far from water, found themselves encircled. Bohemond formed his men into a tight ring. Shields locked, spears braced, banners raised. Inside, priests chanted, their voices rising over the screams. For hours, the Turks rode in circles, loosing arrows from horseback, darting close, vanishing into the dust. The Crusaders fought like a single creature made of iron and desperation. By noon, they were near collapse. When from the west, the sound of horns cut through the chaos. Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond of Toulouse had arrived, leading the Second Army. They charged into the Turkish flank, their knights thundering across the plain like a wave of steel. The Turks broke, then fled, leaving behind corpses and broken arrows. The Crusaders stood among the bodies, stunned that they had survived. That victory at Dorylaeum became a legend almost overnight. Chroniclers wrote that angels had fought beside them, that Christ himself had turned the enemy's arrows aside. But those who had stood in that dust knew better. It was hunger, discipline, and sheer stubbornness that had saved them. Still, victory came at a cost. Thousands lay dead. Food was scarcer than ever. Disease spread through the camps. And for the first time, the Crusaders began to understand that this was not a pilgrimage. It was a war of endurance. From Dorylaeum they turned south, through lands scorched and empty. Weeks stretched into months. Men became skeletons, their armor hanging loose on their bodies. Horses died by the thousand. The only constant was prayer. Muttered, shouted, whispered in the dark. They saw signs everywhere. The shape of the cross in the stars, in the wind, in the way a sword caught sunlight. Every omen became a message, every suffering a test. The idea that they were chosen carried them when nothing else could. By October, the survivors reached the walls of Antioch, a city that had once been one of Christendom's jewels. For centuries it had stood between East and West, rich in trade and faith. To the Crusaders, it was more than a city. It was the key to Jerusalem. They could not march further without it. But Antioch was vast. Its walls stretched for miles, lined with hundreds of towers. Its defenders were well supplied and winter was coming. The siege began, and it would become one of the longest and most brutal in medieval history. For 8 months, the Crusaders starved outside its walls. Their camp became a graveyard of tents, bones, and fever. At first, they tried to maintain order. Knights patrolled. Priests preached. They built siege engines, dug trenches, burned fields. But soon, the hunger came. Men ate grass, rats, and their horses. One chronicler wrote that the flesh of fallen enemies was sometimes roasted at night. A whisper of cannibalism passed through the camp like a curse. Others spoke of men boiling leather shoes for broth. Still, the banners flew. When the rain came, it turned the ground to a swamp of filth. When the cold came, men froze beside their fires. Every prayer became a plea not for victory, but for survival. Within the city walls, the defenders mocked them, sending arrows tipped with scraps of bread. They threw rotting heads over the walls, the stench of decay drifting through the camp like a cruel sermon. And yet the Crusaders refused to leave. They believed that turning back would damn their souls. Better to die before the walls of Antioch than to return home unpurged. Then, as if by design, famine turned to treachery. One of the city's guards, a man named Firuz, an Armenian converted to Islam, secretly approached the Crusaders. He had grown bitter with his superiors, fearful for his life. He offered to open a gate. On the night of June 2nd, 1098, under a moon veiled by clouds, a small band of Crusaders climbed the walls. The gate opened, the army surged in, the city fell in chaos. Streets ran red, soldiers looted, civilians were slaughtered, mosques burned. The Crusaders knelt in the churches they had reclaimed, their hands still wet with blood. For a few brief hours, Antioch was theirs. But then the impossible happened. Even as they rejoiced, a vast new army appeared, the forces of Kaboga, the Atabeg of Mosul, come to retake the city. The Crusaders, exhausted and half-starved, found themselves trapped inside the same walls they had just conquered. The hunters had become the besieged. Inside the walls of Antioch, the air was thick with the smell of death. The Crusaders, who had stormed the city only days before, now found themselves trapped within it. Their victory had become a prison. Outside the gates, the army of Kaboga spread across the plains like a living sea, disciplined, well-fed, and endless. Inside, there was famine, fever, and fear. The men who had come to save Christ's tomb now slept beside unburied corpses. They drank rainwater from their helmets and gnawed at leather straps. The winter wind howled through the shattered gates, and the sound of prayers filled the night, desperate, broken prayers that no longer asked for glory, only for a sign that they had not been forsaken. In those days of despair, something strange began to happen. A soldier named Peter Bartholomew, a poor man from Provence, claimed that St. Andrew had appeared to him in a dream. The saint, he said, had revealed that the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side on the cross, lay buried beneath the floor of the city's cathedral. If they could find it, God would grant them victory. The commanders were divided. Some called it madness, others called it hope, and in the end, hunger made them believers. So they dug. For hours, men clawed at the dirt beneath the altar with their bare hands, their breath ragged, their faith fraying. They found nothing. The soldiers began to murmur that the vision was false. Peter himself jumped into the pit, still digging, praying aloud. Then, as the night deepened, he cried out. From the earth, he lifted a spearhead, rusted, ancient, dark with age. The crowd erupted. Some wept, others fell to their knees. Whether it was truly the Holy Lance or not no longer mattered. It was something to believe in. Word spread through the camp like fire. The relic was carried through the streets, kissed by men who had forgotten what it meant to hope. Even the generals, hardened by war and suspicion, found themselves moved. They took it as a sign that God had chosen them once again. Within days, the Crusaders prepared to march out. They were a shadow of the army that had first arrived, barefoot, starving, many too weak to lift their shields. But they believed now that angels walked beside them. Priests rode with the army, holding the lance aloft. Trumpets sounded, the gates opened. Kaboga's army waited on the plains, confident, watching the thin lines of Crusaders stumble forward. The Turks laughed when they saw them, emaciated, ragged, glowing with fanatic light. But then the impossible began to happen. The Turks charged, arrows blotting out the sun, their cavalry circling in great waves. The Crusaders closed ranks, moving like one immense body, singing hymns as they advanced. The priests shouted blessings over the din. Some accounts say a cold wind swept across the field, a sudden storm that struck the Turks in the face. Chroniclers wrote that the saints themselves appeared above the battlefield, spectral riders clad in white, their swords flashing with divine fire. Whether seen or imagined, the vision transformed the Crusaders' terror into fury. They pressed forward, shields breaking, horses bleeding, men shouting the only word that still meant anything. Deus vult. God wills it. The Turkish lines broke. Panic spread. What had begun as a siege ended as a rout. Kaboga fled, his army scattering into the hills. When it was over, the Crusaders knelt among the dead and sang Te Deum Laudamus. We praise thee, O God. They had survived the impossible. They had turned starvation into victory, yet what remained of them was not holy. They were thin, haunted, and half-mad. Antioch was theirs. But Jerusalem still lay far to the south, and many now wondered if they had the strength to reach it. Months passed before they marched again. The city was stripped of food and plundered beyond repair. Disease carried off many of those who had endured the siege. Some knights refused to go further, content to keep their new lands in Syria. Others quarrelled over titles and command. The Crusade, born in faith, now trembled on the edge of collapse. But among those who pressed on was Godfrey of Bouillon, a man who believed that victory meant nothing unless it ended in Jerusalem. He gathered what was left, perhaps 12,000 souls, from the hundreds of thousands who had once begun. They marched south, following the ancient roads through a landscape of dust and ruins. By the time they reached the walls of Jerusalem in the summer of 1099, they had become something else entirely. Not armies, not pilgrims, but survivors bound by the weight of their own story. Jerusalem was held by the Fatimid Egyptians, who had taken it from the Turks only a year before. The city's walls were high, its gates sealed, its cisterns full. The Crusaders had no siege engines, no ladders, no supplies. They could see the city from the hills, the golden dome, the narrow streets, the stone glinting in the heat. For 3 years, that sight had haunted their dreams. And now, it was real. Some fell to their knees in tears, others stripped bare, and walked the last miles in silence, believing that humility would please God. Priests led processions around the city, chanting and carrying relics. The Muslims on the walls watched them and laughed. The siege began. It was a war of exhaustion, fought by ghosts. The heat was unbearable. Water was so scarce that men sold it for silver. Horses died faster than arrows could be loosed. Yet still they prayed, believing that to die before Jerusalem's walls was to be reborn in paradise. Then came a moment that the chroniclers would describe as divine providence, and modern historians would call sheer luck. From the port of Jaffa came a small fleet of Genoese ships, Christian sailors bringing wood, iron and tools. The Crusaders dismantled the ships and dragged the timber across the desert to build siege towers. They worked by night, singing hymns to drown the groans of the dying. On the morning of July 15th, 1099, they attacked. The towers rolled forward on creaking wheels. Archers climbed their platforms. Priests lifted crosses high above the chaos. Bohemon's men struck the north wall. Godfrey's forces struck the west. Flaming arrows filled the sky. Stones shattered. The smell of pitch and blood hung thick in the air. Godfrey himself, standing in his tower, is said to have loosed the final arrow before a breach was made. His men poured through. The gates fell. The Crusaders entered the city they had dreamed of for years, and what followed was no holy procession, but a slaughter. Every street became a river of blood. Muslims and Jews alike were cut down. Some fled to the mosques for refuge. The conquerors set them alight. Chroniclers, even those who praised the victory, wrote that the carnage was beyond description. When it ended, Jerusalem was silent except for the chants of the victors. Barefoot, covered in dust and blood, they climbed to the church of the Holy Sepulchre and fell to their knees. There, amid the echoes of death, they wept and prayed. They had reached the tomb of Christ. They had cleansed their sins in the fire of war. They believed they had fulfilled God's will, but in truth, they had only written a new chapter in humanity's oldest story, the one where faith and violence walk hand in hand, where salvation leaves shadows behind it. And when dawn rose over the city the next day, the stones of Jerusalem glowed red. When the killing stopped, the Crusaders wandered through Jerusalem in silence. The city they had dreamed of was real, and yet it felt hollow, a place too empty, too quiet for all that had been promised. The streets still glistened with the blood of those who had lived there. The bodies lay unburied, the air thick with smoke and incense, as if holiness and horror had become the same thing. They had taken the city of God, but not one of them looked like a saint. Godfrey of Bouillon, the man the survivors looked to as their leader, refused to be crowned king. He said he would not wear a crown of gold where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. Instead, he called himself defender of the Holy Sepulchre. It sounded noble, and perhaps it was, but even that humility could not wash away the memory of what they had done. The Crusaders divided what remained of Jerusalem and its surrounding lands among themselves. Bohemond took Antioch. Raymond of Toulouse claimed Tripoli. Godfrey held Jerusalem until his death a year later. Their kingdoms were fragile, built on blood and the shifting sands of alliances, but for a time they stood. To the people of the East, It was the beginning of a new age of war, an age that would stretch across 2 centuries and claim countless lives. The Crusader states, they were called, Christian enclaves carved out of Muslim lands, defended by fortresses, and fed by pilgrims who came seeking salvation. For Europe, it was proof that God's favor could be won through steel. For the Muslim world, it was a wound that would never fully close. But in that first brief moment after victory, none of them saw the future. They saw only the sunrise over the city of their faith. Chroniclers wrote that the first light fell on the dome of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and that the Crusaders wept. They believed the end of days was near, that Christ would soon return, and that their suffering had brought redemption for the world. And perhaps, in their exhaustion, they did feel something holy. But time has its own truth, and holiness, like war, is rarely what it seems. The First Crusade had begun as a sermon, words carried on cold French air, a plea for aid from distant lands. It ended with an empire born in the desert, and a question that history still struggles to answer: how faith so pure could become violence so absolute. Even the chroniclers who celebrated the victory wrote with unease. One of them, Raymond of Aguilers, confessed that the blood in the streets reached to the ankles of the horses. And yet, he said, this was the righteous judgment of God. Such was the age they lived in. To them, belief was not gentle, it was fire. When news of the conquest reached Europe, church bells rang from Paris to Rome. Sermons were preached, men wept in joy. To the peasants and priests who had sent their sons eastward, it seemed as though heaven had touched the earth. For a generation raised on famine and fear, the idea that ordinary men could conquer the holy city was a miracle. But for those who had walked that road, who had buried their friends along the way, who had starved beneath the walls of Antioch, who had seen what victory cost, the miracle had another face. Some never returned home. They stayed, building lives among the ruins, marrying local women, defending what they had taken. Others limped back across the sea, scarred in body and spirit. They carried relics, sand and silence. They spoke of what they had done in whispers, as if the memory itself were too heavy to carry. The Crusade changed everything. It opened the roads between East and West, bringing trade, knowledge and disease. It turned faith into a weapon and war into ritual. It showed what happens when human longing for the divine collides with the world's harshness. And in its shadow came others, the Second Crusade, the Third, the endless echo of faith and vengeance repeating across the centuries. But none would ever again feel like the first. The First Crusade was a beginning, the moment when Europe, hungry, desperate and believing, reached beyond itself and touched something vast and terrible. It was the moment when men learned that even the holiest cause can carry the weight of human sin. Now, more than 900 years later, we still live in the long shadow of that march. The story of how belief can build kingdoms and how it can destroy them. So as we drift back from those blood-soaked walls, from the chants and cries that once filled Jerusalem's air, let us remember the people behind the banners, the peasants who walked barefoot to the ends of the earth, the knights who sought forgiveness through fire, the preachers who believed they were saving the world, and the nameless ones who simply wanted their pain to mean something. They were not heroes, nor demons, but human, flawed, hopeful and afraid. And like all of us, they searched for a heaven they could not see, in a world that would not let them rest. As the desert wind moves once more across those ancient stones, the echoes remain, the prayers, the footsteps, the silence after the storm. If you've stayed through this journey, may it remind you that every age has its crusade, and that the hardest battles are not always fought with swords, but within the heart. Now rest easy, dear listener. The fires of Jerusalem have cooled, the dust has settled, and history sleeps once more. Good night from the Drowzy Historian.